Hi, I'm Skipper Chung Warson, and this is the second season of the How This Works show. This is where we talk to 100 people about what they do and their journey, from their first steps to where they are today. On this episode, I'm talking to Chui Chui Tan. She's a cultural strategist who has orchestrated successful market launches and growth for the likes of Spotify, Netflix, and Bumble across 50 plus countries. She's also the author of Research for Global Growth, Strategies and Guidance for Cross Cultural Insights, as well as International User Research. Thanks for joining me, Chui Chui. Nice to see you again.
Thanks for having me.
So, Chui Chui, I sketched this out a little bit in the intro, but what did I miss from the way that you might normally introduce yourself? Can you set the stage for the this part of how this works and what we're talking about today?
I would say I help businesses to navigate cultural nuances for global growth. So that
Hmm.
is my one-liner pitch on what I do normally.
Yeah.
So my background is actually user experience, and I have been focusing on international aspect of the business and user research for more than 16 years. And yeah, so now I'm focusing a lot on helping businesses to understand and identify and simplify really cultural nuances
Mm.
so that they can see how they can translate that into more into business decisions,
Mm.
so that they can create products or services or experiences that is more resonate better with the local market and local audiences.
Yeah, because people are different all around the world.
Yeah, we tend to say like globalization is happening now, and we will become more and more similar. But
Mm.
ultimately, the culture is going to be always going to be there, and there are differences in terms of so many different levels that it's impossible for all of us to become one. Really.
Yeah. Yeah. So, would you mind sharing something unexpected, maybe a surprising detail about yourself that you'd be comfortable sharing?
Um, yeah. So I think one thing that not many people would know about me is that I seem to have a lot of opinions, and I have my thoughts that I easily share with a lot of people. But
Mm-hmm.
because my background is, well, I'm from Malaysia, so I'm Malaysian born
Mm-hmm.
Chinese. So when I first came to the UK to study my master and then PhD, and for a few years after I start working, have my career in UX and HCI and so on, I
Mm-hmm.
actually was struggling a lot in terms of having my own voice and having any opinions.
Mm.
And I remember when I first doing my PhD, we have to do literature review. You read a lot
Mm-hmm.
of papers, and then you say, okay, what you're going to think about each of the argument and studies and everything. I
Mm-hmm.
remember my supervisors asking me about that, and I look at him blank, and I have no opinion. I just read the paper, and that is it. So it was so hard for me to write the first chapter of the thesis because
Mm.
it's hard. I think thinking it back, that is because we're talking about culture. Thinking it back, I know that's really very much to do with our education format in Malaysia or in Asia in
Mm-hmm.
general, because we are very much um, more focusing on memorizing stuff and just we don't actually being asked opinion about what do you think about these stories or what. So we
Mm.
just sit on our chair on our table and just copy whatever is being taught at front, in the front from the teacher and everything. So and that go across until my undergraduate as well. When
I
I did
see.
my undergraduate in Malaysia, we still doing that, and presentation is a big thing. We don't present, we have to present our 5 minutes presentation, our thesis. I remember everyone was so nervous because like we never have to stand in front of anyone to talk about anything. So
Sure.
yeah, it's funny enough, one of my ex-colleagues in my last company, he would look at me when I said that to him, and he was just like, what happened in between? Because obviously now I have so many opinions.
Sure.
So yeah, so that is one thing that people didn't know about me, and in when they actually see me now.
Yeah. So I wonder, and you hinted at it already. You talked about being um, Chinese-born Malaysian, who you're now in London. Can you walk me through a little bit of that geographic map of where you've been in the world, where you've worked? Just kind of give me that sort of map pin. Just give me a little bit
Mm.
of a rundown of where you've been and where you've worked.
So yeah, I'm Malaysian born Chinese. So I moved to the UK 21 years ago, just over 21 years ago. So so
I'm sorry, I
those
got that backwards. So it's Malaysian-born Chinese.
yes.
I
So
think I
my
said it
grandpa
backwards.
Malaysian born Chinese, yeah, or
Okay.
Malaysian Chinese is fine. I think both are the
Okay.
same.
Got it.
So yeah, my grandparents actually from China or
I
near
see.
Taiwan as well. So we they so I'm third generation in Malaysia, and Malaysia
Okay.
actually it has three main ethnic groups as well. So you have Malay, Chinese, and Indian. So basically, I'm Malaysian born
Okay.
Chinese, but I'm also Malaysian Chinese, if that
I
makes
see.
sense.
Okay.
And so I moved to the UK 21 years ago, and so these are the two countries that actually base. I spend my half of my life in each country.
Sure.
In terms of where I have worked in, so I have traveled. I actually keep a list of which country I go to and which cities I go to as well. Since I start working for myself,
Okay.
or actually since my adult life. And I also have a note like I have three code: one C, H, and W. Like C is conferences, like I go to
Uh,
those places for conferences, and then
sure.
H is for holiday, and then W is for work.
I see.
So I actually calculated that the other day. I have been 48 countries.
Oh,
So that is combinations of everything, right? Like work conferences, speaking conferences, and also for
sure.
holiday. So in terms of working, even though I'm based in the UK, but all my clients, the people I work with, they're actually across the whole globe. I'm
Mm,
talking about my clients, but also the local teams I work with, because understanding culture means I have to work with local teams that I bring them
mm-hmm.
into my company and as my
Mm,
team. So that means I actually constantly working with people from different backgrounds, different countries, and so on. So yeah, that means even though I live in two countries, but I touch on all different cultural backgrounds and languages. Although I don't speak all their languages, but it's very interesting always to see how people from different backgrounds um, communicate and talk to each other and how they deal with things and interact as well. So yeah,
mm,
that's I think I'm feeling lucky that I always have this opportunity to expose myself really to
yeah.
different culture and different people from different part of the world.
Yeah. So Chui Chui, you mentioned a little bit about university and going for your postgraduate work. Can you talk a little bit about what, where, when, like paint a picture for me
Hmm.
where you were when you first got interested in this idea of cultural contexts and user behaviors? Like, how did you get started in this work that you do?
Yeah, so I my first degree is actually mechanical engineering. So
Ah,
I did that in Malaysia. I actually worked as mechanical designers for Panasonic
hmm,
for a year and a half before I moved to the UK, and
okay,
was designing audio set like your MP3s and MD
okay,
players and things like that with CD players and everything. That tells my
okay.
age really. Uh, and so yeah, after that, I always felt like I really wanted to see the world. For some reason, I always think the world that I wanted to see is the UK. I have no idea why. I
Hmm.
was quite ignorant at the
It
time as
just
well.
drew you for some reason.
Yeah, I didn't know much about my geography. It was really, really bad at that time. I know not much and I was ignorant about everything. And I tried to get people to backpacking with me, but no one really wanted to because in Asia, like you tend to finish your degree or university and then you find a job and then you start working. And taking time off doing nothing is kind of
Hmm.
not really common things people would do. So
Yeah.
eventually, I just decided to kind of uh, do a master course. So that is easier for me to get to the UK as well. And I thought, since I'm going to study again, I might as well study something I really like, but I didn't I didn't manage to do it, or if I wasn't talented enough to kind of see myself to to make that into a career. So I like
Mm.
music, and so I decided to do something about to do with music. So I applied for master course in music technology
Mm.
in Belfast and Northern Ireland. I remember
Okay.
my dad was saying like so many places you can choose. Why do you have to go to the Northern Ireland? Because I actually didn't know about the conflict at the time as well, because it was still quite new at the time.
Sure.
So yeah, I went to Belfast to do that for 1 year, and then because my dissertation was about my thesis was about audio games,
Okay.
so when I finished my master, a lecturer came to me saying that we actually got a grant, a European grant that get us to do projects that collaborate with 15 other universities and companies
Mm.
across the Europe to help visually impaired people to access visual using multimodal interfaces.
Oh,
So, for
interesting.
example,
Okay.
tactile or haptic or audio and certain things.
Mm-hmm.
And do I want to do it? And I just like, sure. I wasn't ready to come back to the UK because I still didn't feel like I know the culture as much. It's funny enough, at that time, I didn't even thought I'm interested in cultural aspect of the world, but at
And
that
this was
time,
in Northern Ireland, right? This
mm,
is
in
you were still there.
Belfast. Yeah, I
Got
was
it.
still there. I just still feel like I didn't know about the culture as enough because it's just 1 year. Most of my course mate was Northern Irish or Irish,
Mm-hmm.
and I still want to spend more time here. So I thought, yeah, sure, I will do the PhD, not knowing what I'm going to do or what I should will be doing, what PhD is about.
Mm-hmm.
Um, so because of that, I actually do a lot of interviews with visually impaired people and understanding their challenges, how they actually access um, use computer at that time with screen reader and all those things, and that kind of helped me to fall into the HCI, human computer interactions industry. At that
Sure.
time, it was still quite new. The whole industry was still quite new. There's no such thing of usability or UX, user experience, or anything like
Mm.
that. So I started to go to conferences like CHI, like computer human interactions conferences in
Mm-hmm.
San Francisco, and present paper and things like that. So I kind of accidentally fall into user experience or HCI industry, and
Sure.
I started to work in an agency in Bristol. I moved to England after that, and at that time while we were still doing a lot of wireframing, you do it all. Like it's not like you do research, you do wireframing, you do interaction design, you do it all, or
Sure.
information architect and everything. But I think at one point, one of the main clients for that agency at the time, Marriott International Hotel, they started to kind of realize they need to understand more about people, their guests or people, travelers from different parts of the world, because they have different needs and so,
Mm-hmm.
and so on. So I, because my background, I'm the only non-white or non-British in that company. It's kind of, you speak many languages, and at that time, China was kind of main market for them. So
I
they
see.
said you can speak the language. It's my mother tongue, Mandarin. So take on that project, and we start working on that. So I traveled. My first business trip was to Beijing,
Oh,
to help them to understand. It's kind of interviewing people in Chinese people and how they go about booking holidays and hotels and what their needs and so on. So since then, they become a really huge clients for us, and I become their only global or international consultant that I work
mm.
with them. So I start traveling with them to Qatar and a lot of other countries and so on, helping
Mm-hmm.
them to understand not just on the digital side, but also when in the hotels, what does that involve and so on, and also help them to create a playbook for their international design system and so on. So yeah,
Mm-hmm.
from that instances that I start to talk about international research a lot. I start to publish the ebook. When I talk in the conferences, I talk about cultural differences and how people from different places kind of use products differently and so on. So that kind of planted the seed into the whole international exposure in terms of what I do.
Mm-hmm.
And and then we start to get a lot more projects in the agencies about international related with Google, with anything like that. And 7 years ago, 8 years ago, I actually decided to start to work for myself, and
Okay.
I could be any UX consultant if I like, but because my niche is in international, and this is what people know me about, and
Mm-hmm.
so I decided to niche in this area. And since then, I started working with many companies, and it started to evolve from purely user experience and how people use product into more strategy. And looking into not just the product, but also all aspects of the businesses on when they
Yeah.
go into a new market, what should they do? What if they want to grow the market? What should we look into? I'm talking not just about how people behave and what people want to do and what people say they want to do. My approach is more about the whole overall holistic view about the market, the people, the ecosystem. So we look into even the history of the countries and the
Mm.
infrastructures, the politics set up, the economy, because all of this is actually going to influence how people behave and the context of use and their mentality and value. And all of this are actually related. So it becomes much bigger in terms of what we look at when it talks about growing and launching in a new market.
Yeah. It's interesting that you've moved from that layer of what is the experience like? What do the customers want? That needs, wants, uh, desires, pain points, like moving sort of up the chain into then more product work, then more strategy work, and then more business work. So this becomes not even just a user problem or a design problem, but it becomes a much larger sort of ball of wax that you're kind of peeling back in order to understand some of these nuances.
Yeah, exactly. Because if you think about that now, especially if because culture is really huge, right? It's a big thing that
Hmm.
it doesn't touch on how people just use a product, but it's
Hmm.
overall ecosystem of that. And also thinking about being successful or failed failed in a market. It's just like, oh, are you not market your products in the right way, or is that because
Right.
your product is not resonate very well with the locals? It's the whole everything of it. Is whether the proposition is correct, that when you
Yeah.
go into the market, did you position yourself in the right way? Did you provide the did you serve your products in a way that people can resonate with you? So yeah, there's a lot of elements that actually led to the failure or the success of a business in the market.
Yeah.
That's why you need to touch more on all aspect rather than just one thing about the
Yeah.
experience or so on.
So you've worked with a lot of big name companies, and some of them I mentioned in the introduction, like Spotify and Netflix. I wonder when a company comes to you that you haven't worked with before, and even if you're familiar with maybe the geography or the culture in which they're interested in standing up a new product, or maybe it's um, a previous product that is, like, I know that a company like Netflix is even now launching in new markets. So what does that look like? And I'm not sure where exactly they're not operational, but let's say, there's one country that they haven't launched in. When a company comes to you and they have this paradigm of, we want to know more about this country, and you already mentioned things like history and sort of recent events and cultural norms, what are other things that you think about when first starting that work with some company that's just come to you?
It depends on how big where they are in their business as well.
Like their
The
maturity level, like their
yeah,
size.
yeah,
Okay.
exactly. So yeah, Spotify and Netflix, they are huge, right? Already have launched in different countries. They know what they are into, and they just need to know the elements of the things that operation side and how they should launch it in the right way and so on. But
Mm.
also, if you kind of think about the smaller scale, let's say not startup but more mature startup that is ready to
Mm-hmm.
launch in the new market, so that is a different setup that I will actually look into in helping them. So for example, if let's say if we talk about smaller setup companies, that this is the time that we are ready to launch in the new market, what should we do? One of the
Mm-hmm.
things that I often would do with them is actually to identify which markets that is actually the best market for them to go into, the
Mm.
most optimal market to go into. They normally
I
have
see.
some idea about which market they want to go into. For example, based on a lot of time it's based on language. It's just like, oh, we go to the countries that is actually speak English. It's easier, or
Sure.
Spanish because it's cover a lot of Spanish speaking countries and so on.
Sure.
Or sometimes it's more because they already see a natural growth in that market that they haven't done anything, but actually they can see the growth, so they want to focus on that. But sometimes
Okay.
most of the time I will ask them to step back to say, actually, let's figure out which market is the right one for you to go into next.
I
And I
see.
have an exercise to do it with them that, if I simplify it, it's more about like looking into comparing between the opportunity, the market size, and so on, and also the effort that you're going to need to succeed in the market. So,
I
for
see.
example, in some markets, you have big opportunity, like for example, India or China is huge
Yeah.
market to get in because huge populations and so on. But then when you look into the effort, it probably will take a lot of effort because the regulation is very different. Because you are fintech, the regulations, you need to go through a lot of hoops and everything to get into that. And
Yeah.
language is very different. Their mentality in terms of accepting or using your products or this kind of services or domain that you're in is very different. So you need a lot more efforts and investment to get into. So is that worthwhile? So you start to plot all these different things and also to identify what are the things that you didn't know about that market already that might hinder your launch in that market and so on. So
Yeah.
with that exercise, normally we'll come out clearer in terms of which market we should focus on in the near future, and then in the long term and so on. So that's normally the first step.
Yeah.
If let's say it's very clear already that the market that's chosen is the right one or is the optimal one, then we will, one of the
Right.
exercises I do as well with them is to understand what are the things you think you know about the market already, and
Mm.
what
Assumptions.
are
Yeah.
the assumptions and knowledge gap and so on. So
Yeah.
there's another exercise I do with them. It's more workshop related. So I call it four
Sure.
bucket exercise. So I gather the key people in the company together. This could be for the big companies as well. So I did that with a job board company in Asia, which and APAC as well. Like it's huge in this part of the world called Seek or Job
Mm-hmm.
Street. So we did
Okay.
that for one of their market as well. So we bring everyone in to say, okay, let's put your insights or the things that you know about in one of these four buckets. So for
Mm-hmm.
example, the first bucket is known facts. So we know that it's
Mm.
true, is information that we know is true, is already fact checked, and it's already, you have a lot of studies and data to fact, and you can make decisions just based on those facts already. So those we'll
Sure.
put in the bucket. And then the second bucket is I call it strong hypothesis. So it's
Mm.
educated assumptions really, and it's kind of almost true, but then we might need a bit more information to kind of make it stronger so we can move them into facts.
Mm-hmm.
You might actually just need a bit more data or just validate it quickly or invalidate it quickly to
Mm-hmm.
complete that the knowledge of that. And then the third bucket is weak hypothesis. So this is more assumptions, that objective assumptions, that oh, we hear people saying that our local team thinks it's this way and that way. So we need a lot more work to kind of finalize that. Or we can say we know about this bit, but we don't know the other bits to complete the whole picture. So what we should do about
Yeah.
that. And then the
Yeah.
last bucket is unknowns bucket. So it's
Oh.
known, unknown, and unknown. So it could be like we
Yep.
just don't know how Japanese view gender equality, for example. So that kind
Mm.
of thing. So once you plot that, then it's easy for us to, well, first of all, to align, everyone aligned with what we think about the market, or we know about the market, or we didn't know about the market. And secondly
Mm-hmm.
is to identify what are the missing knowledge, that insights that we need to know so that we can make decisions. How, to what extent the research or the data need to be collected, what
Mm-hmm.
kind of informations can we combine them. Some of them is from this one insight is from this bucket, the other insight for this bucket, but they are relevant. Can we do something so that we can answer both questions?
Sure.
So, but this exercise you have to very make sure, especially the first bucket. When we do when we did this 1 day remotely with a group of 15 people, I remember everyone, they are all C levels or director level, all of them put
Mm-hmm.
in known fact. Um,
Mm.
and then I started going through that, because this bucket, remember, once you think it's fact, you don't do anything about it. You can make decisions based on that. So if you
Right.
use a wrong assumptions and put it in there as a fact,
Right.
then you're making the wrong decision. So I was very strict with them in that bucket. I just like, do you have a backups? How do you know this is a fact? Do you have a references and everything? So as I go through the post-it note one by one, I can see a lot of them start moving the post-its to the other buckets, because it's like
Yeah.
I have no proof or credibility to support that. So
Yeah.
yeah, so once you have that exercise, then we can actually make sure, can we make some small decisions already based on what we know already, and then we can start testing, and what kind of research or information that we need to. So it helped us to navigate what the next steps is in order to make a decisions in the correct way. There are a lot of way to, there are a lot of growth strategies or consultant out there, and everyone use very slightly different approach. My
Sure.
approach is more insight and data led, because for
Mm.
me, because of my background, maybe is UX, and is more focused on the research and also the data, and what is the truth, so that we can make
Yeah.
decisions. So for me, it's often, although it's often will involve research or some kind of research, it could be a survey, or could be a very quick research or testing or whatever, but it always have to have something to back it up,
Yeah.
to make the right decisions. So
Yeah.
that's what we normally do. But if it is a big company, then it's different. So for example, Spotify actually don't have any new market team anymore, because they launched most of the countries they want to launch.
Mm-hmm.
But before they launch in South Korea, for example, or
Mm.
Sub-Saharan Africa. So I was involved in part. I play a small part, because it's a huge operation, right? And so
Sure.
yeah, we were doing certain elements in terms of trying to find out how are the companies actually being successful in, for example, in sub-Saharan countries. We didn't even get to the users first. We actually talked to experts in the area, journalists or
Yeah.
DJs, and all the uh, director levels of international companies who are successful in launching the company in the
Mm.
business in that market. So we kind of gather as much information about how the whole ecosystem of the business work in that countries, and what does
Yeah.
that mean to Spotify, for example, or to that specific domain. Um, because each domain actually, when you talk about different market, is actually very much different. So for example, if I worked with Asana before, the
Mm-hmm.
work management tool in Japan. The same trip I
Mm-hmm.
went there, and then the week after I was with Spotify. So even
Mm.
though it's about Japanese culture, but the
Right.
things we look into are completely different. The
Yeah.
context of culture is different. So that's why it makes it quite complicated in terms of understanding a market, because it's not just about the market, but it's also how it's relevant to the product and services and the industry you are in as well.
Yeah. That makes sense because it's not only the product, the offering, right, that you're putting out there for customers, possible customers, but also this idea of taking the things that you know about that. So the people who use, so even if you, let's say, were working with Spotify in Japan, and then also did work with Asana, the types of people who use Asana are different or slightly different from the types of people in Japan that would also use Spotify, right? So there's also not a generalization about this is the kind of person, this is the tribe that you're looking for when you're launching a product like this.
Mm.
And then I also think that something around not everyone in the country also is homogenous in that way. There may be some generalizations that you can make, but not every person in Japan or not every person in sub-Saharan Africa um, operates under a blanket of kind of principles and paradigms that you can measure on a scale.
Yeah, exactly. And back to the first point you make as well, it's like even though so as we were talking about Asana and the people who actually use Asana and also Spotify
Yeah,
might be different. They might be the same person, right?
they
They
might be the
might,
same person too. Yeah,
yeah, but the context of the cultural, how cultural values and the cultural aspects surfaced or manifested are
right.
differently, right? Like so when it
Yeah,
comes to the same person when they're using potentially using Asana as a product in their working environment, they
yeah,
care they don't care about other elements that the facts that about how they self-express in music. They
yeah,
don't, that is not important anymore when it comes to interacting with a products such as Asana. It will be
yeah,
more hierarchical, like how do I interact or communicate or assign work with my colleagues. So the aspect of the cultural aspect that we look into will be different.
yeah,
um, that's why it's very complicated when you we go into a new market to think about cultural, because the whole word culture is so big. Like what does it touch upon, right? Like I talk about culture being in the air, where it's around us, it's embedded in our daily
hmm,
life. It could be the music we listen to, the songs we listen to, or the language that we speak or not speaking, because we make a
hmm,
lot of noises, Asian, like Chinese especially, like yes, and like
hmm.
a lot of sounds, and those are also part of our culture, or the
Sure.
celebrations we do and so on. So I think that is why it's kind of like when you go into a market, we need to know how to pick and choose what cultural aspect and value and context to look into,
Yeah.
that is relevant to that specific domain of the business that you are in.
Right. Right. Well, about a month ago, you actually posted on LinkedIn something about a book called The Culture Map by
Mm.
Erin Myers. And that's a pretty famous book, I think, in the world in which you work. Can you talk a little bit about how companies or groups can use frameworks like this, but then also stay mindful for the culture that they're thinking about, um, and, and not necessarily think about them as a not necessarily a like a step-by-step method, but using it as a framework for how to think about. And I'm also aware that you've written two books yourself, so like how do you think about a paradigm like what Aaron Myers lays out in the culture map?
Yeah. So for those actually not familiar with this book, it's so Erin, you have that book.
Right here.
Yes,
Yep.
I'm in Malaysia at the moment, so I don't have the book with me. It's back in the
Sure.
UK. So Erin's book is about, so she created actually 8 dimensions
Yeah.
that focus very much on how people, basically she helped people to navigate cultural complexities when it comes to business communications. So
Hmm.
that include you work with your colleagues from different backgrounds, or vendors and suppliers relationships, that actually from one culture than the others. Or
Hmm.
a lot of examples she used in her book is about um, accusations of a company, like a Mexican company bought a German company or vice versa, and
Hmm.
then they have to, the managers and all the setup is very different. So she defined 8 dimensions that
Hmm.
actually help people to navigate. So one of them is, for example, is I can't remember. So one of them is about communication. So how you
Hmm.
communicate. Is that more like very straightforward, or actually I just talk? You have to read between the lines. And then the
Yep.
other one is giving feedback. Do you give direct feedback or very high level, so you get it, you get what I say, and so on. So she kind of
Yep.
defines that, and then she had the scale, so she plotted the countries along the scale for each of them. So Japan
Yeah.
might be like in this, on the left side of the scale, and then but on the other dimensions, Japan might be in the other scale, and so on.
Yeah.
So I the book is very useful because it's very much on business communication. I can see how it's useful for a lot of people that I talk to as well. They talk about when they work with people in different culture, that book has helped them to justify or rationalize why things are not being communicated very easily, or why things are not being done after being communicated, and so on.
Sure.
The thing for me about, I have a view about framework in terms of culture. So if we don't talk about Erin's framework for business communications, there are a lot of cultural dimensions out there. So the most famous one is Hofstede or Hofstede's. So that is very common, right? Like individualism
Hmm.
and versus collectivisms, power, hierarchical, and so on. And then there's others as well, like Trompenaars and so on. I actually have more issues with those framework, not because it's not useful, but I find it really hard to apply it practically. So give you an
Mm.
example, like if I tell you, I give you two scores, one South Korea and one UK or US.
Sure.
So individualism versus collectivism. One is a very high on collectivism and one is very high on individualism. How do you
Yeah.
translate that into an action, right? How do you
Yeah.
use that to design something, design your website, or how do you use that to create your strategies and so on? So it's very hard, and
Hmm.
um, it becomes really hard to very subjective. So I
Yeah.
find it a lot harder to use and also a bit more subjective and not as practical. I found a way that you could potentially use this kind of framework like the Hofstede or Trompenaars is see how things are manifested. So for example, if a country is high collectivist society, how
Hmm.
it's manifested in, let's say, in healthcare. So
Hmm.
more collectivist society means that actually they spend more time, the whole health, they take care of each other's health. And when
Mm.
look at, like for example, when my mom actually felt slip one last year or 2 years ago and broke
Okay.
her one of her bones and everything. So a whole
Okay.
family, me and my siblings, three, four of us actually go together with her to see the doctor or the specialist and so on. So it becomes a very a family matter really when it comes to health related. And how does
And this was in
collectivism?
Malaysia, right? That this happened?
Yeah,
Okay.
yeah, in Malaysia. But then
Because I
we
saw
can
you
see
posted on LinkedIn about it.
exactly.
Yep.
Yeah. So about that, like how people in Malaysia, what, yeah, the post that you were talking about is like I was bringing my mom, that is for for quarterly checkup. I was sitting
Hmm.
there, I just observe every single elderly people actually accompanied by their kids. They are
Sure.
all mobile, and but the kids are always with them, they always accompany them. So what does that mean to, if you're a health tech company
Yeah.
or you're designing, so you need to actually cater for that kind of behavior, you need to be bigger and kind of have a system that actually cater for more family viewing
Yeah.
on those things. But if it comes to, let's say, IKEA did a very good one in India. Before they launched in India, they actually
Mm.
visited 1,000 houses in India to
Mm.
understand how people live and so on. So they do a lot of local adaptations, not just on products, but also on their operations and so on. So being a collectivist society in India means multi-generational household
Right.
is very common. So how do you sell the products that you're selling? Need to cater for that.
Yeah.
Or family gathering, spontaneous gathering is very common. So you need to have things that you can stack up for the chairs and
Yep.
stools, things like that. So you can use all this framework to say, okay, if it is highly individualistic countries, how does that manifest it in the behaviors for the domain that you are in? So that's one
Yeah.
way that I can see this kind of framework be useful. Back to the Erin's framework, I think hers is much more practical because she focused very much just on business communications. So it's
Right.
very narrow. So
Yep.
when it comes to communications, there's only certain elements that is involved, right? Like feedback
Yep.
and how people respond and so on. So
Yep.
hers is very practical. She can use you can actually use that very easily on that.
Yep.
But when for mine, I actually focus very much on business growth, that
Yeah.
business expansion. So as we talk about, it touches on a lot of different aspects. It could be coming from authority figures or relationships or infrastructure setup. A lot of different elements. So it's very hard to kind of put it in a framework that say in this country they behave in this way. So you plot it in one
Right.
frame because there are a lot of elements that inform and forms how people behave in certain um, things, not
Yeah.
just one cultural elements that led to a certain mentality, for example.
Yeah. 100%. I would say that I have found the culture map helpful. The last company that I worked for full time was a Ukrainian American consulting company. And one of the things that was helpful, not just for the products that we worked on, because we worked on projects all around the world, a lot of them were in the United States, but increasingly throughout my time there, we were also working on products that were also operational south of the border, so in Mexico and Colombia and Chile and adjacent areas. And one of the things that I thought was really important was to take the design team, so from an operational perspective, and understand what might be some of those beliefs and um, systems that folks who are in the Ukrainian team, what would they align to in terms of leading, deciding, or even the idea of disagreeing, right? Where do they fall on the spectrum? And really, at least generally, understand where are their differences. And that's
Mm.
not to say that we didn't utilize it in other ways. So, for instance, I can think of a project that I worked on. It was a healthcare project, and the client team was mostly Indian. Now, granted, they weren't in the country of India, but their background was as folks who were born in India, born and raised in India, who now lived in other parts of Europe. And so, one of the things that we found super helpful was to actually plot them out according to where Erin Meyer said generally that these traits lie. And it was helpful to understand how they received feedback, what kind of hierarchy they conform to, because it was slightly different. And once we could have some of those soft conversations to understand where they were coming from, it made the working together so much easier.
Yeah, yeah. That is exactly what I hear a lot of people was talking about when they talk about the book, being able to. I think it's that two ways, right? Like sounds like you can use that to rationalize, to explain really like why things are not working as well,
Sure.
and that helps you to navigate as well. Say, okay, then we can see how we're going to use this to give feedback, for example, in other countries, and once like using that. I think frameworks like this is useful for the explanations. Like you see a certain behaviors, even
Yeah.
for the Hofstede's one, you see certain behavior, and you can say, okay, it makes sense because they are actually high in these dimensions. So that is useful, but it doesn't tell you what you should do to
Right.
to kind of overcome that problems. I think Erin's one does because it's actually
Hmm.
more straightforward in that instance. I think the other problems I was thinking about even with Erin's one is when you plot a countries against a scale,
Hmm.
how it makes it very static, right?
That's
Because it
right.
makes it
Yep.
very stereotype as well. Like this is exactly everyone in that country behave. And when you see
Right.
something, then you just use that as a reasons to explain that. But then there might be nuances that is not, or in other contexts, it probably doesn't behave like that. So that's why
Yeah.
for me, it's kind of like plotting countries on scales sometimes feels a bit too fixed, and
Yeah.
and and culture does change slightly, evolve,
Yeah.
not
Yeah.
very quickly, but some is to a certain
Yeah.
extent. In certain elements, they will change. So how does that work? And the other thing that I was thinking of as well
Yeah.
is like you need a lot of data to cover all countries in the world. So
That's right.
if you
Yeah.
look at Erin's and on her website, you can pay to actually access the
Yep.
comparison countries, or you look at Hofstede's ones. I think they cover quite many, like 50 or something, but it doesn't cover a lot of them. I think Hofstede's
It's
one
not
in South,
everything.
yeah, in Hofstede one in Africa, I think they only have 2 African countries so far with the
I see.
data. So
Yeah.
I think in like any tools, it's always useful. I think all these frameworks are also good in raising awareness about cultural differences. I think
Yeah.
that is very important because a lot of people, even though they know their differences or they say like they cannot judge others of not being the same as them, but
Yeah.
it doesn't it doesn't actually occur to them actually why those differences and how those differences are. So all these framework actually raise a lot of awareness in terms of okay, I can see why they think like that, or I can see how they behave like that. So yeah,
Right.
there are pros and cons as limitations, I guess.
Yeah. And I wonder even about making it really personal with you and I having this conversation now. You Malaysian Chinese, having lived in London, as you said, in outside of Malaysia for now half your life, a lot of it in the UK, um, and myself, my mother's Korean, and born and raised in the United States, though. How do those different elements of culture, so I wouldn't necessarily find you on a framework like any of the three that you've just mentioned. I wouldn't necessarily find you in the UK, uh, and I don't know that I would fully find myself in the United States either, because of the cross-cultural component of both of our own lives. So that, going back to that idea that as human beings we're really complicated, and so just because you're in a country or you've been raised in a culture doesn't necessarily mean that this is exactly how you will act, as you said, like static points on a spectrum.
And also I believe you and me as well, I can speak for myself. It's like I can be more British in certain aspect of my life,
For
and then
sure.
when it comes
Yep.
to certain things I'm quite Malaysians or quite Asians.
That's right. That's right.
So yeah, it's like where do we belong, right? Like where do we now,
Right.
if we have to fix in certain things, like do we move from one dimension to the others, like oh suddenly in this dimension we are British and suddenly the other one we are Malaysians. And so
Yeah.
yeah, it's quite, that's why it's kind of like it's very dynamic. um
Yeah.
yeah, but again,
Yeah.
those tools are still useful in certain ways. It's how we go about using them.
100%. And I
Mm.
think the framework that you described before about having the four buckets, right? What do we know? What are strong hypotheses? What are weak hypotheses? And what are assumptions? I think that's also important to understand with the team that you're working with. What is it that we know amongst ourselves? Because in this day and age, you can go and ask an AI tool or internet search for something, or do deep research, look at a country's history, whether you're doing book research or you're looking on Wikipedia or wherever it is. You can have all of that information, but in the end you need to have that human agreement that here's what we know, here's what we don't know, let's go figure out some of these other things, and um, fashion our path forward.
Yeah, exactly. Talk about framework. Creating a framework, but it's not a framework. It's more like canvas. If you think about
Sure.
the business canvas, because I was just thinking that there's so many different aspects of culture that we need to think about. Like I was saying, like the politics, the geography as well. Geographic actually does of a country does influence, the geography of a country does influence how people behave in certain ways as
Sure.
well, because of the limitations or the availability of resources or things like that.
Hmm.
So
Hmm.
even that we have to consider into the understanding of the countries or the culture, or the context as well. So there are so
Yeah.
many different things. So I have been spending a long time to trying to simplify them as much as possible and group them into a um, different group, I think, and
Mm-hmm.
in terms of like core values, and within the core value they have anything. I have been using that. For example, I'm preparing for a work to help a client to understand their Colombia um,
Mm.
market. So I've been using that to say, okay, now I have this in this framework. I have, for example, the first one I have about social context. So we
Okay.
have authority and hierarchy. Is that
Mm-hmm.
really relevant to this domain, and what does that look like in Colombia? And then
Sure.
relationship, and then every single things, and then you have infrastructure, digital infrastructure, physical infrastructure, and all the different things, and trust as well. Like, so
Yeah.
every single element, it actually helped me to think about within each of these contexts, or each of these aspect, what are the things actually we can find out about Colombia, and what does
Yeah.
that mean to this business or these clients, their business. So for
Yeah.
example, one of the value is that they have live in the moment mindset. So what does
Mm.
that mean? So they are more likely to want to pay for something that the promotions, they are more thinking about now,
Ah,
that
interesting.
last minute, I just want to use it now and I'll pay now. So it could be the truth of how they manifested. It could be help you to actually create hypothesis for you to bring into kind of test it. Otherwise
Sure.
you will go into a research blank, trying to find every information. So I have been
Yeah.
using this canvas to kind of identify which of the important nuggets that we need to look into on that. So yeah, it's complicated, like you say, but it's
Yeah.
also make it very interesting, isn't it?
Yeah. And all of these things that we're talking about, we'll make sure to have links in the show notes. So that way people can, if we're visualizing something, maybe there's an example that we can pull out, maybe like your 4 buckets, or maybe even the framework that you just described, if you're comfortable in sharing that.
Sure, definitely,
Okay.
yeah.
So, Chui Chui, I wonder how you envision your work in the future, right? To zoom out for a moment, what sort of trends or challenges do you see emerging in the kind of work that you do around culture and strategy through the lens of business?
For the future, I think it's very hard to have a conversations now these days without talking about AI, right?
Yeah, there we go. Here it comes.
So I don't think so. A while back, actually last year, I was doing an experiment with a friend on how AI could be used for cultural elements. We know there's a cultural biases, right? Like when
100%.
ChatGPT and all those things,
Yep.
because for many reasons, because the informations or data being used to train are more
Mm-hmm.
all English, or in a certain context, and then you have
Mm-hmm.
a lot of other biases and being work and in Gemini and things like that. What we were looking into as well in that experiment is, if a company trying to use AI to or LLM to help them to figure out, instead of going to do research or finding data and so on, use
Mm.
LLM to say, what should I know about this market, and how advise me, give us
Yep.
advice on what are the strategy we should do, how
Sure.
accurate, how complete. So we were trying to measure that. So we actually tested ChatGPT. This is
Mm.
last year, and Baidu's Ernie's. So it's like Chinese, and then we have Jai's, which is
Okay.
Arabic. So we
Okay.
tested for China one. We actually compared ChatGPT with the Chinese Ernie's, for Chinese market, so they know about the
Okay.
market better and so on. And then we compare, and then
Mm-hmm.
Arabic is Saudi Arabia. We use that. So
Mm-hmm.
it's very interesting in terms of it's useful. I think like any other context that AI is being advised to use, is it's good to give you a starting point. It will tell you,
Yeah.
so you might want to look into this. You might want to look into this kind of social behavior in these countries, or the Islamic teaching on that. But it's
Sure.
very high level, and also it's not complete, and has hallucinations happen as well,
Yep.
to a
The
certain
errors. Yep.
extent. Yeah. So yeah, it's actually used. You could use it as a starting point, but you always need to check. But what the
Yeah,
problem I'm looking into is that it doesn't really give very detailed context in terms of the nitty gritty, the insights that is very important that you will only get when you talk to people or you observe how
sure.
people are doing it and so on. So you talk about future. So I think people will start trying to use this in any way they can. Um, so there's a challenge. I don't think it will replace what we can offer as a human, and how we're going to look into that kind of complexities of cultural elements.
Hmm.
But I would be interested to see how that being evolved in playing into, because in the future, like we have DeepSeek now, we have
Right,
Chat from
right.
France that actually
Yep.
I think is very popular at the moment. So if
Yeah,
let's say a company who knows technology is going to go evolve very quickly, especially in this area, if let's say the training there's a one technology or one LLM is going to actually have different data from different points, that
yeah,
it becomes so powerful, will they be able to provide even better or stronger in terms of cultural elements on that instances?
sure.
I don't know whether that is possible, but I think that is something to look into,
Yeah,
I guess.
yeah. And I wonder about putting a large language model or whatever AI tool search you're using. I wonder about putting it through the your four buckets framework as well,
Mm,
right? So putting it in the same just a participant in the room with yourself and the team and maybe C-level people or whoever's operational, and using it as an input, but not using it as, okay, here's the definitive guide to what the culture looks like in this area, or what the um, what the components of this kind of buyer looks like. Like, don't take that at its face value. Take it and interrogate it and do the due diligence to understand what is, like you said, a hallucination, what is real information, and then what is information that actually shows up currently in those customers by going out and talking to them.
yeah, yeah, that's
Yeah,
actually a very good point. I actually haven't made the link into, yeah, the four bucket exercises.
yeah,
I can definitely see the link. Like you say, like using that if you don't have as much information, because sometimes the market is so new, like the
yeah,
whole business actually have not much knowledge or data point to get into. Um, I guess LLM will be a good start, but it's just be careful, like to put the right in the right bucket and to ask the right
yeah.
questions when they come up with the output as well.
That's a really good point that you make in terms of how best to use the tools. I wonder, Chui Chui, is there a topic that we haven't covered yet? Something specific that you'd like to get into?
Um, Yeah, I think one of the things though, currently I'm reading Sapien, A Brief History of Humankind.
Oh, okay.
Do you know about it? So
No,
one of
I don't remember his
the,
last name, but
yeah, Yuval, I actually have this book because I'm reading Yuval Noah Harari.
oh, okay. Oh, sorry, I'm thinking of another book. Yep.
Yeah,
Okay.
this one. I think he has another two books. Recently, he has another book. I'm reading. I started to read this book is because I'm just thinking about, like the whole world is is we are in a crazy world at the moment. Like I always thinking about,
Everywhere.
yeah, everywhere. It's like the differences, and people are talk like it's very hard to accept who everyone are, right, in terms of
Yeah.
culture or races or ethnicity or even identity or so on. So it
Yeah.
actually made me think this might be my next book, but this might be my retirement book to write. So I'm just thinking, like, I think I was curious about where does all these differences start? Where does that stem
Mm,
from, right? Like, if a human
mm,
start from one, depending on how we actually believe in human evolutions, right? So, like, but how does that change? Because the cultural, the changes or differences is not just about how we behave and mentality and so on, but it's also our gene, right? Our physical, like physical everything, right? So how does that start changing? I was thinking about the borders because Geographic
Mm,
does make a difference. There's another book I was reading when I visited my friend in Berlin. It's about how Geography actually changed countries in terms of their
mm,
economy and everything.
mm-hmm.
So this is a huge topic. I'm just it's
Yeah.
something in my mind, like at what point we change and why so we are technically we are same, right? We are a sapient, right?
Yeah.
um, so why the differences and how does that evolve and so on, and what does that mean in not just business? We talk about cultural elements in business, but it's also in our life, daily life,
Yeah.
and also in our governments and everything. I
Yeah.
remember I was giving a talk to a German university, and all the students are very young, like 18, 19. It's a small area of Germany, and
Mm-hmm.
so a lot of them actually haven't gone out and exposed to a lot of different culture. But their lecturer were actually using my models in their classes and everything.
Oh,
And she
cool.
gave me feedback. She says, "Oh, your model is easy to understand and different level of culturalization and everything." She said
Mm,
she got the feedback apart from the working with on the products like different for different culture. A lot of them came and says, "Oh, after your courses, I understand my parents better because their
oh.
parents were immigrants. So they are,
Oh.
but they grew up in Germany as Germans. So they start to understand why their parents behave in a certain way, or their boyfriends in from different cultures. It's like, oh, we have less fight
Mm-hmm.
now, and so on. So it's interesting in a way that understanding cultural differences and all this complexity and being observant about them and being
Yeah.
I think it's useful not just on business context but also in personal life for everyone. um,
Yeah.
so that's why I'm really excited about like going university. I think every kids we should start kind of teaching about like spreading this kind of concept into
Yeah.
as much as possible.
Yeah.
um,
I was thinking about while you were speaking, funny enough that you brought up that idea about separation. About there's an American poet named Robert Frost who one of his most famous poems is called "The Mending Wall," and one of the most remembered lines from that is so the narrative in the poem is that the there are two sort of parcels of land. One has apple trees and the other one has pine trees, and there's a wall that separates the two. And the voice of the poem says, "Do we really need a wall to separate the pine trees from the apple trees? Like it doesn't seem like that's necessary." And then the neighbor says, "Well, good fences make good neighbors." And that seems really apropos in terms of what you're talking about, because do they really? I'm not really sure.
Yeah, it's the same, right? I was thinking about borders. I just like, when does
Yeah,
border started? Like, how do we define this bit, and then this bit is this country, and the other bit is the other country, and the culture is
that's
different.
right.
Like how
Yeah,
does that happen? I think I need to. Yeah, that is one thing I really want to dip deeper into it and trying to understand, make sense of that.
yeah.
Eventually, and write a book and simplify it and write a book maybe about that.
Well, I can't wait to see how those thoughts develop. So I look forward to the book when you get to that point. So Chewy Chewy, let's get into our closing questions. And these are closing questions that we ask all of our guests. But we've already done sort of a little bit of a metaphorical and poetic exploration. But I wonder if there's a significant lesson in your life or in your work so far that you wish you might have learned earlier.
This is probably more life, but also apply in work as well. I think like most recently, I'm just learning how to, I say care less. Like
Hmm.
it doesn't sound like it could sound negative in a way like I care
Sure.
less about my work or whatever. But what I meant by that is care less about how people think about me, for example, care less
Hmm.
about other elements that are happening that I don't have to be involved in because it's none of my business. Because,
Right.
like for example, I'm visiting my family in Malaysia. I'm staying in a house that have 8 people. It's eight,
Mm,
seven, including me, is eight. And I stay here sometimes for a month, 2 months, 3 months when I visit my parents. So there are a lot of things. They have nephews and nieces, and sometimes I feel like care less means that I don't involve as much. So there are
sure.
less things to stress about or things like that. But also at work as well, like you care less about um, how things if things actually didn't go your way, or
Right.
actually you felt like you can do better, or I felt like I can do better, then I should care less about how it being perceived in some way, because it's already happened. But it
Sure.
doesn't mean like I don't care about the quality of work or about my clients. It's more care less about the things that not as important, that be more acceptance, and
Yeah.
let go, really.
Yeah.
So that's one thing that I wish I know earlier, and I'm still in the process of learning it to be even better in these instances. So yeah.
Yeah. Well, I think there's another part to the care less, which is then you need to decide what you care more about. So
That's a
there's the
good
other
point.
piece that kind of like works with both, but and it's also that care less also sounds like the one word, like if
Careless.
someone is careless, they're not paying attention or they're not, but you're talking about care less like the two words sort of sentence.
Exactly. Care less
Yeah,
about things that is not as important, like you say.
that's
I
right.
like you pointed out about what is the other way around, like what should I care
Right.
more and pay more
That's right.
attention and put more effort and energy into the things that is important to me.
Yeah. So you've already talked about Sapiens, and we've talked about quite a lot of other books just on this episode. You have two books yourself, but what's something that you're reading or watching or listening to that you would recommend to our listeners?
um I I haven't been watching much at the moment, because I'm been here. But actually, one thing that I have was watching quite a lot before traveling. It was Netflix on what's it called? Culinary Class Wars.
Oh, okay.
Did you know that? So it's
I
actually
haven't heard of this yet.
it's South Korean. Koreans, they actually brought in a lot of all the famous, very high prestige chefs, and then
Oh,
those are actually very, it's more like stalls and shops and restaurants and so on. So they actually have um, competing against each other, but then they bring them together, and then they one of the episode is about business as well. Like if you want to start a restaurant, you need to think about your menu, you need to think about your pricing, you need to think about how to
hmm,
attract people, because they brought in a group of people to say, okay, now you have 3 stores. Each
right,
stores have a few chefs, and they have to think
right.
about menu, and they are all these people that actually brought in to eat the food. They are
Hmm.
given a chunk of money to order whatever they want. So it's based on the menu they order, and they kind of compete against who actually won the prize. So I love that. And I actually found out that there's so many Korean words actually quite similar with Cantonese. Um,
Hmm.
that they sound very, very similar. I didn't realize that because I know Cantonese, and I always find Korean languages is quite complicated for me to understand everything. But
Yeah.
from that series, I kind of realized there are a lot of words actually similar. But then again, I start to look into why, and it's very interesting. Again, the
Hmm.
culture elements of how Chinese characters actually influence South Korean, as you probably know. So yeah, something
Yeah.
I was watching. I listen to a lot of podcasts though.
Is there one podcast you're listening to right now that you're really jamming on?
I listen to a lot of the Diary of CEO
Hmm. Okay.
from Stephen Bartlett, because he actually brought in not just about business, but it's also a lot about health, about how you present yourself, how you communicate. A lot of different experts from different. It touches on different point of your life, like for example, if
Yeah.
personal life, mental health, or health in
Yeah.
general, but also business and entrepreneurships as well. So yeah, that I do follow that quite a lot.
Got it. Yeah, it's all connected. So Chui Chui, if you had a day off suddenly and you had unlimited resources to do whatever you want in that one day, what would you do?
One day,
One day. Unlimited resources, but a constraint.
constraint. One day, if my parents are still around, then I will bring them to wherever they want. Just a very
Mm,
quick trip to somewhere they want and enjoy whatever food, really nice food, or experience certain things with them. If
got it.
not, I really want to do a crash course of for drumming.
Oh, okay.
It's something that I actually went for a few classes, but I really want to just get on with it and do a very intense course.
Okay.
Find a really good teacher for that one day, since I have
Sure.
unlimited resources, so
Right.
I can get
Right.
anyone.
That's right.
Yeah,
Get
so
the
that's
world's
something.
most expert.
Yeah,
That's nice. So I'd like you to make a prediction. What is one thing that you think will be true in a year?
1 year is actually pretty soon and short.
Mm-hmm.
So I would imagine that we will still be worrying and talking about the same things as we have been this year and the last year. So, for example, we will be still talking about AI and how it's going to influence our life and our job, and people are
Sure.
still worrying about how it can be useful and harmful in some ways.
Yeah.
We will still be talking about equality and um, sustainability and so on.
Yeah.
Maybe in a different level, a different context, but I think this we will still trying. I think we will still be struggling and thinking about how we can actually pass through this. Hopefully, in a few more years, things will change.
Yeah. So, Chewy Chewy, where can people find out more about you? Where are you online? What other places should people look for you?
So I have my website beyo.global,
Okay.
and on there you can find the link to my books as well. I'm more active on LinkedIn,
Mm-hmm.
and I also have started a YouTube channels at Chui Chui Tan. So these
Okay.
are the top three channels that I'm using and where you can find me easily.
Awesome. Well, thank you for your time today with the conversation. I know that I learned a ton just us talking back and forth.
No, thank you. I love the conversation with you and the questions and discussions we have as well. So thank you.
And that's it for this episode of the How This Works show. We appreciate your support. Subscribe so you don't miss out. This podcast is a part of How This Works Co., a product strategy and design practice where we find ways to work better together and produce the right outcomes for your growing company. And until next time, remain ever curious, and we'll talk again soon.